My name's Lynn Lavery, and welcome to What's New in NVivo 12 for Windows. This demonstration will take you through what some of the key changes are. My intention is that those of you who are already using NVivo 11 will be able to quickly update yourself by watching these videos. All of the key functionality has remained the same, so there's no need to learn from scratch if you're already up to speed with NVivo 11. This short demonstration will hopefully be all you'll need. This obviously isn't a session for beginners. If you're brand new to NVivo, I'd suggest exiting out and finding yourself an introductory course. We do have a number of courses that cover NVivo 12 from the very beginning, and they would be a much better use of your time if you're just starting out with the software. I'll begin by demonstrating the key differences, and then I'll finish off with discussing issues such as when the best time to upgrade is, and how you can convert your existing NVivo projects to an NVivo 12 format. As this is just a demonstration, I'm not expecting you'll be following along with me on your own computer. If you already have NVivo 12 installed though, you might like to open it so that you can start to explore it a little while I'm talking. I'd like to begin by discussing the new interface and some of the new terminology that NVivo 12 uses. I've launched NVivo 12 on screen, and probably the first thing you'll notice is just how similar it looks to NVivo 11. Let's open the sample project to show you some of the differences. One of the first things you might notice is that the quick start steps look a little different. They're now a series of short videos, which I think is a great idea. It probably won't make much of a difference to those of you watching, as you'll already be familiar with NVivo. But for researchers who are brand new to the software, they look pretty helpful. Let's just close that down. The navigation view down the left-hand side is quite a big difference, both in terms of the way it's organised, but also the terminology that's used. They are both things that you'll need to get used to in NVivo 12. Functions have moved around a little, and a number of them have also been given more intuitive names. I think those changes will be really great for those who are learning the software, but if you've been using it for a while, it might take just a little wrapping your head round. To make it easy for you, I'll talk you through the changes and explain what's different across the two versions. Just a warning, it may initially sound like a confused mess as I go through it, but if you keep a careful eye on screen as I talk through each one, you'll pretty quickly see that it's all very straightforward. I'll work from the top down, and the first change is that sources in NVivo 11 are now called data in NVivo 12, and internals are now called files. It all works exactly the same way. Your interview transcripts, surveys, social media data, PDFs of journal articles, they all get stored in the same area. It just has a different label of files and more specifically data. You'll also see there's a new file classifications folder in this area. I'll be coming back to that, but for now I'll continue to move down the navigation view. Nodes are still called nodes, but they're organised in a new codes area. Once again, that's pretty intuitive and should make it a little clearer to those who are new to the software. If you're wondering where cases have gone, they were previously in the nodes area, and something that's quite a big shift is that cases have been broken out into an area of their own. I think that makes a lot of sense, NVivo users always struggled a little to understand the difference between nodes and cases, and breaking them out separately should hopefully help clarify that. Now, in case you need a reminder as to what the difference is, your nodes are boxes that store data that relates to your coding. Cases are boxes that store information about things like the people or organizations within your project. In other words, the cases that you're using for your analysis. Now, once again, I'll leave the classifications folder you see here, and we'll come back to that a little later. The next thing you can see is a brand new section for notes. This contains functions that were already in NVivo. They've just been grouped together here in a more sensible way. So the new notes area contains memos and framework matrices, which were both previously under sources, and also annotations and see also links, which were previously stored in something called collections, which has now been removed. I was really pleased to see this new grouping. I think it makes a lot of sense. These are all functions that allow you to record your own thoughts and thinking. I think the loss of the collections area really isn't a biggie. Most people never even noticed it was there. Next one on the list is search, which I also think is a much more sensible grouping. This contains your queries and the results folder, which is where you can save the results of your queries. The node matrices folder has also been moved here. They were previously located under nodes, which was a little confusing. In case you're not familiar with node matrices, they are where you save the results of a matrix coding query. Also located in the new search area are sets and search folders. They've been moved from collections, which, as I've mentioned, are no longer in this version. Maps is one of the only things that hasn't changed, so maps are still maps. And lastly, there is output, which is simply the new name for what used to be the reports area. You can see that reports and extracts are both there, just like they were in NVivo 11. Now, there was previously an area for classifications in NVivo 11, which you can see has disappeared. Just a reminder that classifications are a way of recording demographic or descriptive information within your project. Things like gender of your participants or year of publication of documents. Classifications in NVivo 11 could be assigned to sources and cases. In NVivo 12, because of that new terminology, they're assigned to files and cases. They also no longer have an area of their own, and instead they're sensibly grouped with the type of item that they relate to. So you can see that file classifications are up here under data, and case classifications are in the new cases area. Well, hopefully that didn't sound too confusing. As you can hopefully see, while a lot of the terminology and organisation has changed, it is all incredibly intuitive, so I don't think it will take you long to get used to. I've certainly been finding my own way around pretty easily. Just one last thing to mention about the navigation view. There is a brand new quick access area that allows you to quickly access functions that you use a lot. Files, nodes, and memos can already be found there, and I certainly find for me, they're the three places I spend the most time in NVivo. But if there are other things that you'd like to add, you can simply drag and drop them up there. I'll show you how that works by dragging and dropping maps up. So as you can see, it's pretty straightforward if you want to add things to it. Another minor change concerning the interface relates to the ribbon options. In NVivo 11, there were 8 tabs on the ribbon, and we have a reduced set of 5 here. They've really tried to simplify things for the user. Now, in case you're wondering where some of the options have gone, a lot of them have been moved onto context-specific tabs. So if I open up a document, you'll see that a document tab opens up for me with all of the options I need to work with that particular document. Likewise, if I open up a node, the same thing applies. Just to give you an example of something that's been moved, in NVivo 11, if you wanted to turn on coding stripes, you would have done that from the View tab of the ribbon. In NVivo 12, you can still turn on coding stripes, but the option is on the Document or Node tab, depending on what you're turning coding stripes on for. Other than those changes I've just outlined, all of the basic functionality remains the same. So as I said earlier, this definitely isn't an upgrade where you'll need to do a lot of new learning. You'll find that things generally work the same way as they did in NVivo 11. I'll give you a few examples of common tasks, just to reassure you that everything is the same. If I wanted to import a transcript, I could do that from either the ribbon or via a right click. If I wanted to code, that's also done just the same way as I would have done in NVivo 11. My preferred coding technique is to drag and drop data to a node, and you can see here that I'm able to do that exactly the same way. Now, while most of the functionality remains the same, one minor difference I wanted to mention is that being able to see the attributes associated with a particular case is much more straightforward in NVivo 12. If I come here to the new Case Classifications area, I can much more easily see the attributes for each case. Well, hopefully that quick run-through will help you find your way around when you start using NVivo 12. Let's now move into some of the new functionality. The big change in NVivo 12 is improved support for mixed methods research, and there are certainly a few more options for you to explore if you're conducting a mixed methods study. I'll start out by showing the new Crosstabs feature, which has been added as a new query in NVivo 12. For those of you familiar with matrix coding queries, it's quite similar in terms of functionality, in that it allows you to look at your nodes broken down by particular attributes, such as demographic characteristics. So for example, you might be interested in comparing your males and females across some of the nodes you coded at to see if there was a difference in terms of how they spoke about a particular idea. A crosstab query will allow you to do the same type of subgroup comparison with a few added extras that I think you'll really like. Let's see what it looks like. It's listed with the other queries. I'll access it here from the ribbon, but as with anything in software these days, there's obviously multiple ways you can do things. Now, I think you'll find these a little more intuitive than matrix coding queries. The first thing I'll show you is that I can just drag and drop codes from the list view to add them into the query. I'm going to add in the child nodes that are underneath the attitude parent node in the sample project. Now that I've added my nodes in, I can select the attributes that I'd like to cross these against. First of all, I need to select the classification that I want to use, and then I can more specifically select the attributes for the query. Now, the language I'm using here, classifications and attributes, are not new to NVivo 12, so if it sounds like I'm talking a foreign language here, you might want to brush up a bit on how classifications work in NVivo. I'm going to add 2 attributes into the query. I think the fact that you can add 2 is really great. With matrix coding queries, you were only able to include 1. So I'll select here both age group and gender, and I'll run it so that you can see the results. You can see the nodes appearing in the rows, and in the columns is the detail for each age group, which is then further broken down by gender. The numbers that are showing here are the number of cases that have been coded for each subgroup and node. So I can see here that there were 3 females from the 30 to 39-year-old age group that were coded at the negative attitude node. Now the numbers that are showing are a big difference between the new Crosstab query and matrix coding queries, as you can actually see here exactly how many people there are from each age group and gender. There are a number of options that you might like to play around with. You can add colour. There's the usual transpose button. And you can also change the way that the numbers are reported with these options here. Just like a matrix coding query, I can double-click on any of these cells to have a look at what was actually said by that particular group. So I get the best of both worlds here. I can look at the numbers, or I can view the qualitative information associated with these numbers to see, in this example, if different age groups seem to have different attitudes. Just one final thing to mention. The example I've worked through was looking at nodes crossed against attributes. Within the new Crosstab query, you can also cross cases against nodes, which might be something that's of interest for your own projects. Now you might be wondering why you would use a matrix coding query versus a crosstab. The new Crosstab feature is an improvement in a number of ways. As I've just said, with a matrix coding query, you can't easily see how many people are in each group, so they can be a little misleading when interpreting them. Unintentionally misleading, of course. They just relied on you knowing your data and sample really well. So I think if you're just looking for general patterns, a matrix coding query will do the job perfectly fine. But if you're wanting an element of precision in terms of numerical reporting, then a crosstab would be a much better choice. Crosstabs will also be better if you're wanting to include more than one attribute, and they will definitely be a better choice if you have a particularly large query. I work with a few researchers who need to run very large matrix coding queries, and they've taken anything from several hours to several days to complete. We did some testing when NVivo 12 came out, and the exact same queries actually took a matter of minutes. I think that's a pretty impressive improvement, and the team at QSR should give themselves a pat on the back for that one. Now, all of that begs the question, would you ever need a matrix coding query? Well, I think the answer to that, for me anyway, is a definite yes. Crosstabs are specifically for nodes, cases, and attributes, whereas there are lots of other items that can be included in a matrix coding query. For example, you might run a matrix coding query that looks at your sets, and something I often do myself is use them to look for patterns across my nodes. So I think they're still a valuable tool. It's just that the crosstabs function will be more appropriate in certain projects, particularly mixed methods research. A related new feature is working with SPSS data, which is obviously something else you might need for a mixed methods project. I train both NVivo and SPSS, so as you can probably imagine, I was pretty excited when I heard this was being introduced. In terms of how it works, the results of these crosstab queries can be exported into SPSS for further analysis if you require it. Now, it was always possible to export from NVivo to Excel, but you would then have had to transfer it across into SPSS from there. I don't know about you, but I always prefer doing things in as few steps as possible when I'm working with research software, So I really like the fact that I don't need to muck around double handling files. To do the export, I can simply right-click and choose the required export option. And you can see here that SPSS is one of the available options. Now you can do the same thing with matrix coding queries if you're running those rather than crosstabs. Now in case you're curious, I'll open this up in SPSS so that you can see what it looks like. Now I won't go on here and analyse this further. I don't want to be launching into a lesson on SPSS. I still have a few things left to show you in NVivo. While I'm in SPSS though, I'd like to show you the other way that you might want to work with SPSS data. We often have demographic or descriptive information stored in our SPSS files, and they can now be directly imported as a classification sheet. Previously, you had to save from SPSS into Excel and then import from there. And that was fine, but as I said earlier, one step is always better than two. Bringing the classification sheet in from SPSS works in a very similar way to Excel files. Let's use the example I have on screen, which contains some demographic characteristics that I want to assign to cases in NVivo. Just before I close and import though, there are a couple of things I need to point out. Firstly, I have a unique identifier in the first column of data. I personally never rely on the row number, as if I do, any sorting on the file means that I'll lose the ability to identify people. Secondly, this file has something called value labels set up in SPSS. I'll press the value labels button here to show you what I mean. Essentially what this relates to is when I'm entering categorical variables such as gender or ethnicity, I can enter in numbers to represent the groups so that I can analyse them, but I can tell SPSS what those numbers represent. So I can specify that the number 1 actually represents my males and the number 2 represents my females, for example. Now I'll close that file and return to NVivo. And I'm going to come across to a project I've set up previously, just so that things don't get messy here. To import the SPSS file as a classification sheet, I simply select the SPSS import option from NVivo. It's on the Import tab of the ribbon in the Classifications group. I'll select the file, and in the first step of the wizard, I'll ask NVivo to create a new classification for these cases. This particular project doesn't have any classifications or cases set up. So I'll give this a quick name and click Next. The next step is worth being a bit careful about, as the default is that your unique ID for NVivo cases will be created based on the SPSS row number. Now, as I said, I'm really particular about not using the SPSS row number as my unique identifier. So I'm going to make sure I change it here so that it uses the ID that I've specified in the SPSS file. If you're working on a mixed methods project, that step will be particularly important. Your qual and quant data might not match up if the SPSS row number is used. Step 3 is also worth paying attention to. This allows me to ask for those value labels to be used. It would be much more useful in NVivo to have the words male and female rather than the numbers 1 and 2. So I'm going to tick the box here for that. I'll then click the Finish button to bring it in, and you can now see the demographic information from my SPSS spreadsheet appearing in my NVivo classification sheet. Now just a note before I leave the SPSS functionality, you can't bring SPSS files in as data, only as classification sheets. Other survey data, such as Excel files, can be brought in as data, but that's appropriate because you might have your open-ended qualitative responses stored in those files also. It's generally not a good idea to enter open-ended responses into an SPSS file, so there should be no need to import them as data. Classification sheets are far more appropriate. Lastly, in terms of new functionality, something else that's new in NVivo 12 is changes to the autocoding feature. Autocoding has been in NVivo for a while, and what it enables you to do is that if you've used styles in your documents, it will help you to quickly organize similar pieces of text together. You could autocode all of the questions together in one place to view all responses to question 1 in a single location, for example, and you could also autocode to separate out what individual speakers said in a transcript or survey file. I've always been a huge fan of that type of autocoding in NVivo, but the problem is that it does require the files to be correctly formatted with styles, and not everyone's aware of that when they start using the software. For me personally, it was a great tool, but I always had my files set out in the correct way from the very beginning. For a number of the researchers I work with, they often found themselves quite far through their project before they realised that might be helpful, and at that late stage, it can actually be quite fiddly to sort out. That's where the new autocoding tool will be helpful. Rather than autocoding on styles in your document, you can specify exactly which speaker names you would like to autocode on. I'm going to show this in the project I've set up specifically for this demo. Other than the SPSS cases, I've got nothing in this project except for 3 of the sample transcripts. And these were interviews that were with couples, so they're not individual interviews. In terms of why you might want to autocode these, it will most likely be because you want to separate out what each person said within the interview and store it at a case for that person. That way you can assign demographics such as gender. We couldn't do that on the transcript itself, as we have males and females talking in the files together, so it's not possible to assign a single gender. Let's see how that works. I'll select the files first, and then ask NVivo to autocode. You do still have the option here to autocode by paragraph styles, but we'll be choosing the speaker name option. NVivo now allows me to preview each file, and I can look for the speaker names. Once I know who the speakers are, I can then enter them in one at a time. So the first one I can spot is Elizabeth, who is one of the interviewers for the project. I'll enter her in, and you can see that it gives me a tick to let me know that it's found her name in the file. We've also got Maria and Daniel. I can now move to the next file, but just before I do, if I scroll down here, you can see that it has color-coded the preview so that I can see exactly what's going to happen. I'll come to Mary and James next. We've got Mary, James, and the interviewer there is actually Henry. And in the last file, Henry is the interviewer again, so I don't need to repeat that. And I've also got Richard and Patricia. Now, just to show you what happens if I enter a name in incorrectly, if I type Liz instead of Elizabeth here, you can see that it brings up a cross as it can't find the name. I'll just delete that out so it doesn't confuse things. I'll click on Next and create a new classification for person, and then I'll finish. If I now come to the new cases area, you can see that it's made cases for each of those people in the files. I'll open one up, perhaps Maria, since we were looking at her file earlier, and you can see that this contains everything that Maria said in the interview. I think this will be a really great new feature for those that don't have their transcripts set up with styles on speaker names. I think for me personally, I'll continue to set my transcripts up using styles. I think I'd find it a bit fiddly entering in all the names at the autocoding stage, particularly if I had a large amount of files or speakers. I think this new feature will be perfect though for those of you that don't want to muck around with that type of formatting at the transcription stage. Well, that's the new functionality covered. I'd now like to move into talking about some things to consider if you're thinking about upgrading. Most of the points in this section I'll cover outside of NVivo, but just before I jump across to some slides, I did want to show you how to upgrade an earlier NVivo project to NVivo 12. All you need to do is open the project in the normal way. I've got a project here that's an NVivo 11 project, so I'll choose to open that up. You'll see that it brings up a dialog box that allows you to convert. I can change the name and save location using the Browse button if I'd like to, and then I just click the Convert button. Everything will be transferred across into an NVivo 12 project. May take a little time to convert if it's a particularly large project. I'd like to finish off by talking about a few issues regarding upgrading to NVivo 12. I've just shown you how to convert a project, but I guess the question on your mind is, when should you upgrade? My usual advice for this is if you're in need of any of the new functions in NVivo 12, you should definitely consider upgrading now. Otherwise, have a think about where you're at with your project. If you are going to finish your current NVivo project in the next 6 to 8 months or so, and you're not in a hurry for any of the new features, it's probably best to just wait. I never think it's a good idea to change horses midstream, unless you really have to. If the end of your current NVivo project is still a while off, it would be worth considering upgrading now. As you'll hopefully have seen as part of this demonstration, it won't take you long to get up to speed, and you may as well be on the latest version. In terms of accessing NVivo 12, if you have purchased a license directly from QSR, you'll need to contact them to find out what your options are for upgrading. If you use a license that's been purchased by your organisation, have a chat to your friendly IT staff to see what the arrangements are for making NVivo 12 available. If you're at an organisation that has a site license for NVivo, they will have access to the new version, but it's up to them as to when they will make that available to you. Sometimes IT departments like to do a bit of internal testing before they make new software available. If you can't easily get hold of a copy of NVivo 12 and you'd like to try it out, you can download a 14-day free trial from QSR International. Now, as is usually the case with NVivo, there is no backward compatibility. So that means if you decide to upgrade and do some work on a project, you won't be able to open it up in NVivo 11. Have a careful think about that. Some implications are that if you work across multiple computers, you'll need to have NVivo 12 installed on all of them to work on your project. If you're working in a qualitative team, you'll ideally need everyone to upgrade at the same time. Well, that brings me to the end of the demonstration. All up, I think there are some great new additions to the software. It's definitely more intuitive, and I think some of the terminology and interface changes will make it much easier to work in NVivo without having to think too hard about where to find things. I'm also pretty delighted with the new SPSS functionality, as you've probably gathered. Now, there will be future service packs released throughout the year, so keep an eye out for those. If previous versions of NVivo are anything to go by, I think we'll see some further additions to the functionality. If you'd like to learn more, do check out the training courses we have here at Academic Consulting. We offer both face-to-face and online training, so those of you who are not based in New Zealand can still attend. You can also see me individually, either for training, or you might like some advice on the setup of your NVivo project, and that can be arranged either face-to-face or online. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy using NVivo 12 and wish you all the best for any qualitative analysis you might conduct with it.